The fluorescent lights in the abandoned subway tunnel flickered like dying stars, casting erratic shadows across the rusted rails that hadn't seen a train in 15 years. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, feeling the vibration of heavy footsteps above through the bones of the city. Her breath came in measured intervals, each exhale a small cloud in the subterranean chill that had settled into her lungs like ice water. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 30-6 hours ago, she had been sitting in a Pentagon briefing room, watching classified footage of a device that made her hands shake for the first time in her 8-year military career. The nuclear signature was unlike anything in their databases, smaller, more portable, but with a yield that could turn downtown Washington into a crater stretching from the Capitol to the Potomac. The terrorist cell responsible had vanished into the urban underground like smoke, leaving behind only cryptic messages about Judgment Day and the cleansing fire that would reset America's moral compass. Now, crouched in the darkness with her fingers wrapped around the grip of her sidearm, Sarah could hear the steady tick-tick echoing from deeper in the tunnel system. Not a clock, not a metronome. Something far more sinister that had been counting down for the past 18 hours, each second a step closer to an unthinkable ending. Viper 1, this is Command. What's your status? The voice crackled through her earpiece, tinny and distorted by the layers of concrete and steel between her and the surface world. Sarah keyed her throat mic with a gentle press, her voice barely above a whisper. I've located the primary access point. The signal is strongest here, approximately 200 meters into the old metro system. Ticking is audible and consistent. She paused, listening to the rhythmic sound that had haunted her dreams for the past day and a half. Command, I need to know, are we certain about the 3-hour window? Static filled her ear for a long moment before Colonel Marcus Webb's gravelly voice responded. Webb had pulled her from the Special Forces Integration Program personally, had seen something in her psychological profile that convinced him she belonged in the most classified corners of military operations. His faith in her abilities had never wavered, even when her own confidence crumbled during the psychological evaluations that followed her last mission in Syria. Negative, Viper 1. Intelligence indicates the window has collapsed. Latest intercepts suggest activation in approximately 4 hours, but the timeline is fluid. The device appears to have multiple fail-safes, and our technical analysis team believes any attempt to move or tamper with it incorrectly will trigger immediate detonation. 4 hours. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the weight of 8 million lives pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The greater Washington metropolitan area, from the suburban sprawl of Northern Virginia to the bedroom communities of Maryland, all existing within the blast radius of whatever waited. For her in the darkness ahead, she thought of Maya and the kids in Bethesda, unaware their aunt worked in classified operations. Roger, Command, moving to primary objective. Sarah pushed herself away from the wall, her boots finding purchase on the debris-strewn floor of the tunnel. Glass crunched under her solace, remnants of safety lights that had shattered during some long-ago maintenance operation, now glittering like scattered diamonds in the beam of her tactical flashlight. The ticking grew louder as she advanced, each sound seeming to resonate in her chest cavity. Her training kicked in automatically, muscle memory guiding her movement through the underground maze, while her conscious mind cataloged details that might prove crucial. Graffiti tags from urban explorers covered the walls, some dating back to the tunnel's abandonment in 2009. Gang symbols had been layered over city maintenance markers, creating a palimpsest of urban decay that told the story of a place forgotten by official authority but claimed by those who lived in the margins. But it was the newer markings that caught her attention, symbols that didn't belong to any known gang or tagger crew. geometric patterns carved directly into the concrete with precision tools, still bearing the chalk dust of recent creation. A crescent moon intersected by 3 parallel lines, repeated at regular intervals along the tunnel wall like breadcrumbs. Leading her deeper into the darkness, the cleansing tide led by former Army Captain David Reeves. Radicalized in Afghanistan and possessing the expertise to build sophisticated weapons, the tunnel branched ahead, splitting into 3 separate passages that disappeared into absolute darkness. Sarah consulted the GPS unit strapped to her wrist, though she knew the signal would be unreliable this far underground. The ticking sound seemed to echo from all 3 directions, acoustic properties of the tunnel system creating a disorienting auditory maze that made pinpointing the source nearly impossible. She chose the center passage, guided by an instinct she couldn't rationalize but had learned to trust during her years in special operations. The air grew warmer as she descended, carrying with it the scent of something chemical and sharp explosive compounds, perhaps, or the ozone smell that preceded electrical discharge. 50 meters deeper, she found the first body, Agent Jennifer Torres from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Task Force, lay crumpled against the tunnel wall, her tactical vest torn open by what appeared to be close-range gunshot wounds. Blood had pooled beneath her, dark and congealed in the cool air. Her service weapon remained holstered, suggesting the attack had come without warning. Sarah knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse she knew wouldn't be there while her eyes searched for intelligence that might have died with the federal agent. Torres's radio was missing, but her tactical computer remained intact. Sarah connected her own device to the FBI unit, downloading the last recorded data while keeping one ear tuned to the steady ticking that seemed to grow more urgent with each passing minute. The files painted a picture of a hunting party that had located the device's general area but walked into an ambush before they could complete their mission. 3 more bodies marked her path deeper into the tunnel system. Special Agent Michael Park, Sergeant First Class Robert Washington from Army E-Aid, and Dr. Emily Foster from the Nuclear Emergency Response Team, all bearing the same close-range gunshot wounds that suggested they had been executed after being captured rather than killed in firefight. The implications chilled Sarah more than the underground air. Reeves and his followers weren't just trying to detonate a nuclear device in the heart of the nation's capital. They were systematically eliminating anyone with the expertise to stop them, creating a killing ground in the forgotten spaces beneath. The city where screams would echo unheard in bodies might remain undiscovered for years. Her earpiece crackled with Webb's voice, distorted by interference but still audible. Viper 1, we've lost contact with the advance team. Torres, Park, Washington, and Foster went dark approximately 6 hours ago. Are you seeing any sign of them? Sarah keyed her throat mic while stepping carefully around Agent Park's body. Confirmed. KIA on the advance team, sir. Multiple GSWs, close range, execution style. The area is compromised, but I'm continuing to the objective. Negative, Viper 1. Abort and return to extraction point. We'll send in a larger team with respect. There isn't time for a larger team. Sarah's voice remained steady, but her free hand found the small silver compass that hung on a chain around her neck, a gift from her grandfather, who had carried it through 2 tours in Vietnam. The metal was warm from her body heat, familiar, and comforting in a way that helped steady her nerves. The ticking is getting faster. Whatever timer mechanism they're using, it's accelerating. We have hours, not days. Static filled the channel for long seconds before Webb's voice returned, heavy with resignation and trust that Sarah hoped she deserved. Roger, Viper 1. Continue mission. But Sarah ... The use of her first name over a tactical channel violated every protocol they'd trained on, humanizing the moment in a way that made her chest tighten. Don't try to be a hero. If you can't stop it, get clear and let us evacuate what we can. 8 million people. The number refused to leave her consciousness as she pressed deeper into the tunnel system, following the sound that had become the soundtrack to her nightmares. 8 million mothers and fathers and children and dreamers and builders and teachers and artists, all going about their Saturday morning routines while death ticked away beneath their feet. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, part of the original metro system's planned expansion that had been abandoned when funding dried up during the recession. Emergency lighting fixtures hung empty from the ceiling, their broken housings creating abstract shadows that danced in her flashlight beam. But it was the newer additions to the space that commanded her attention. Workbenches lined one wall, covered with electronic components, wire strippers, and soldering equipment. A portable generator hummed quietly in one corner, providing power to a bank of LED work lights that had been rigged to illuminate a central area, where the ticking sound was strongest. And there, suspended from a framework of aluminum scaffolding, like some obscene piece of modern art, was the device that could erase the nation's capital from existence. Creating this intense, edge-of-your-seat content requires countless hours of research and writing. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Sarah had seen nuclear weapons before during her training at the Naval War College, but those had been museum pieces or training mock-ups designed to familiarize military personnel with the theoretical. This was something altogether different, a fusion of improvised construction and sophisticated engineering that spoke to both desperation and genius. The device was housed in a modified shipping container, painted with geometric symbols. Multiple timer displays showed different countdowns, the primary at 3 hours 17 minutes, secondary at 4 hours 43 minutes. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, forgetting protocol as she approached the device. The engineering was more sophisticated than anything in the classified briefings. Multiple redundant systems, anti-tamper mechanisms that would trigger detonation if disturbed incorrectly, and what appeared to be a remote activation capability that could override any manual intervention. Her earpiece crackled again. Webs. Voice cutting through the static with barely controlled urgency. "Viper 1, we're reading massive electromagnetic interference from your location. Whatever you're looking at, it's generating enough signal to jam half the electronics in the city." Sarah circled the device, her tactical camera recording every detail while her mind cataloged the challenges ahead. "Command, I've located the primary objective. It's not what we expected. The device is significantly more complex than intelligence indicated. Multiple timer systems, extensive anti-tamper protections, and what appears to be a remote activation capability. Can you disarm it?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, weighted with hope and desperation that Sarah could feel pressing against her chest. She thought of the manual she had memorized, the training scenarios she had completed, the theoretical knowledge that seemed suddenly inadequate when confronted with the reality of improvised nuclear engineering. "I don't know, sir. The configuration doesn't match any known design. It appears to be a fusion device, but the trigger mechanism is unlike anything in our databases. I need time to study the wiring and the sound from the tunnel behind her cut off her transmission." Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with tactical precision through the darkness she had just traversed. Sarah killed her flashlight and pressed herself against the scaffolding supporting the device, her sidearm finding her hand with practiced smoothness. Voices echoed from the tunnel, too distant to make out words but close enough to confirm her fears. She wasn't alone in the underground chamber. The people who had built this device, who had executed the advance team, were returning to complete their work. And somewhere in the darkness above, 8 million people went about their Saturday morning routines, unaware that their continued existence depended on decisions that would be made in the next few hours in a forgotten corner of the city's underground. The ticking continued, steady and implacable, counting down to a moment that would change everything. Or nothing, depending on choices yet to be made by people who were running out of time. The footsteps in the tunnel grew closer, and Sarah Chen found herself caught between two impossible choices: remain hidden and risk losing precious time to study the device, or reveal her position and face whatever was coming through the darkness. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her Sig Sauer P-320, the familiar weight offering little comfort as she counted at least 3 distinct sets of footfalls approaching the chamber. She thought of her mother's voice from their last conversation, worried and gentle as always. "Sarah, sweetie, you never tell us anything about your work. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating enough?" The questions had been routine, born from maternal concern rather than suspicion, but they had cut deeper than any interrogation she had endured during SEER training. How could she explain that taking care of herself meant learning to kill efficiently, to operate in places where normal people couldn't survive, to make split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died? The device continued its mechanical countdown, each tick a reminder that philosophical questions were luxuries she couldn't afford. Sarah made her choice, sliding deeper into the shadows cast by the scaffolding while keeping her weapon trained on the tunnel entrance. If she could avoid detection, she might have enough time to understand the weapon's construction before. "She's here somewhere." The voice was male, calm and educated, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "The thermal imaging shows fresh tracks leading to this chamber, and the body heat signature is consistent with a single individual." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Thermal imaging meant they had sophisticated equipment, military-grade surveillance that would make hiding nearly impossible in the confined space. She pressed herself flatter against the concrete, willing her body temperature to match the surrounding environment through sheer determination. "Could be one of the feds from earlier," a second voice suggested, younger and less controlled. "Maybe Washington or Foster didn't die as clean as we thought." Negative. The first voice carried absolute certainty. "I put 2 in the back of Washington's head myself, and Foster took 3 center mass. Besides, the tracks are too small for either of them. This is someone new." Light spilled into the chamber as 3 figures emerged from the tunnel, their tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness with precision that spoke of military training. Sarah caught glimpses of their faces in the reflected illumination, 2 men and a woman, all wearing civilian clothes, but moving with the coordinated efficiency of special operations veterans. The leader was a tall man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years in harsh environments. Even without seeing his rank insignia, Sarah recognized the bearing of a career officer, someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions for others. This had to be David Reeves, the former Army Corps of Engineers captain, whose psychological profile filled 3 classified folders in the Pentagon's domestic terrorism database. "Fan out and search the chamber," Reeves ordered, his voice carrying the automatic authority of command. "Whoever's here doesn't have anywhere to run, but I want them alive for questioning. We need to know how much the government knows about our operation." The woman moved with the predatory grace of a hunter, her compact frame disguising what Sarah recognized as serious combat training. She carried an MP7 submachine gun with the casual familiarity of someone who had used it in anger, her eyes scanning the shadows with methodical precision. The second man was younger, maybe late 20s, with the eager energy of someone trying to prove himself to veterans who had seen real combat. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging angles of attack, cover positions, and escape routes while her body remained absolutely still. 3 opponents, all armed, moving with tactical coordination through familiar terrain. The odds were terrible, but she had faced worse during her deployment to Somalia 2 years earlier, when her reconnaissance team had been ambushed by insurgents. In the ruins of Mogadishu, that mission had ended with 2 of her teammates dead and Sarah spending 18 hours hiding in the rubble of a bombed-out school. listening to enemy fighters search for survivors while she radioed for extraction, might never come. The psychological evaluation afterward had noted signs of acute stress reaction and potential challenges with decision-making under extreme pressure. The recommendation for additional therapy had been buried in her file, but Sarah knew the doubts about her mental stability had followed her through every subsequent assignment. Now, crouched in another set of ruins with death ticking away above her head, those doubts felt like physical weights pressing down on her chest. What if the evaluators had been right? What if her nerve broke at the crucial moment, condemning 8 million people to death because she couldn't handle the pressure? "Movement, northeast corner," the woman called out, her weapon swinging toward Sarah's position with lethal precision. "I've got a heat signature behind the scaffolding." Time slowed to the consistency of honey as Sarah made her choice. Rather than wait for capture, she exploded from cover with the aggressive violence that had kept her alive in a dozen combat zones. Her first shot took the younger man center mass, spinning him around before he could bring his rifle to bear. Her second shot shattered the woman's flashlight, plunging that section of the chamber into darkness and buying precious seconds of confusion. Reeves was already moving, his own weapon, tracking toward her muzzle flash with the reflexes of someone who had survived multiple combat tours. Sarah rolled behind one of the workbenches, feeling the heat of bullets passing inches from her head as she sought cover among the scattered electronic components. "Federal agent," Reeves called out, his voice remarkably calm for someone who had just lost a team member. "Military, by the movement and shot placement. Probably special operations, given how she found us down here." Sarah's throat mic had been damaged during her tactical movement, the wire severed by a piece of debris that left her cut off from command's oversight and support. She was truly alone now, trapped underground with terrorists who possessed both the means and the motivation to turn the nation's capital into radioactive dust. "You're too late, soldier," Reeves continued, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "Even if you kill all of us, the device has multiple fail-safes. Any attempt to disarm it without the proper sequence will trigger immediate detonation." And in double quotes he paused, checking something Sarah couldn't see. 3 hours and 8 minutes. It activates automatically regardless of human intervention. The ticking seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the device could sense the violence taking place around it. Sarah found herself counting the seconds between each tick, using the rhythm to steady her breathing and calm her racing heart. Her grandfather's compass pressed against her chest, the small weight a reminder of his stories about staying cool under fire during the siege of Kisan. "But you know what?" Reeves's voice had taken on an almost conversational tone. "I'm curious about something. How did one agent track us through the tunnel system when our advance team eliminated 4 federal investigators? That takes skills beyond standard law enforcement training." Sarah said nothing, using the sound of his voice to triangulate his position while she planned her next move. The younger man she had shot was still breathing, his gasping struggles audible from across the chamber. The woman had gone quiet after losing her light, but Sarah could sense her presence moving through the darkness with predatory patience. "Let me guess," Reeves continued. "Navy SEAL? Army Special Forces? Or maybe one of those new integrated units they're experimenting with, mixing genders and roles that used to be restricted to men." The casual sexism in his voice triggered a flash of anger that Sarah had to consciously suppress. She had heard variations of the same comments throughout her military career, from drill instructors who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles to fellow soldiers who assumed her presence was the result of political correctness rather than merit. The psychological evaluation after Somalia had noted her defensive responses to perceived challenges to her competence, another mark against her emotional stability that had followed her through subsequent assignments. But anger was a luxury she couldn't afford in her current situation. Sarah forced herself to think tactically, using the sound of Reeves's voice to mask her movement as she relocated to a better position. The device dominated the center of the chamber, its multiple timer displays casting eerie light across the improvised laboratory that surrounded it. Looking at the nuclear weapon more closely, Sarah began to understand the sophisticated madness of its construction. The outer casing was indeed fashioned from a shipping container, but the interior had been fitted with precision machining that spoke to serious engineering expertise. Multiple layers of shielding surrounded what appeared to be a fusion core, while banks of electronics provided redundant control systems that could trigger detonation through various pathways. Anti-tamper devices covered the weapon motion sensors, pressure plates, and deadman switches. This was military-grade engineering. "The beautiful thing about fusion weapons," Reeves said, his voice closer now, "is their efficiency. Chemical explosives create destruction through brute force, but nuclear weapons reorganize matter at the atomic level. In a few hours, this device will release energy equivalent to 30,000 tons of TNT in less than a microsecond. The fireball will reach temperatures comparable to the surface of the sun." Sarah could hear him moving, using his monologue to cover his tactical repositioning. Just as she was doing. The cat-and-mouse game was familiar from her urban warfare training, but the stakes had never been this high. Every decision could determine not just her survival, but the fate of everyone living within 50 miles of their current position. "The electromagnetic pulse alone will disable every electronic system from Baltimore to Richmond," Reeves continued. "But that's just the opening act. The thermal radiation will ignite everything flammable within a 15-mile radius. Wood frame houses, gasoline, even human clothing will burst into flame spontaneously." The technical description was accurate, Sarah realized with growing dread. Reeves clearly understood nuclear weapons physics at a level that suggested formal education in the field. This wasn't a fanatic playing with stolen materials, but a trained engineer who had deliberately constructed a weapon of mass destruction using knowledge gained through military service. "And then comes the real beauty," Reeves said, his voice taking on an almost reverent quality. "The radiation will linger for decades, making recovery impossible. Washington will become a dead zone, a monument to the consequences of moral bankruptcy. The politicians who send young men and women to die in foreign wars will finally understand the cost of their decisions." A sound from behind her made Sarah spin around, but the woman was already moving, her damaged flashlight replaced with night vision goggles that gave her a lethal advantage in the darkness. Sarah dove sideways as bullets chewed chunks of concrete from the wall where she had been crouching. Her return fire guided more by instinct than sight. The muzzle flashes lit the chamber in strobing. Snapshots of violent Sarah rolling behind. Another workbench, the woman flanking left with professional efficiency. Reeves moving to cut off the exit tunnel with military precision. This was exactly the kind of situation the psychological evaluators had worried about. A high-stress combat scenario where split-second decisions determined survival. But instead of the panic they had predicted, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her like an old coat. Her breathing steadied, her vision seemed to sharpen, and the chaotic violence around her resolved into manageable, tactical problems that could be solved with proper application of training and willpower. She put 2 rounds into the woman's center mass, watching her crumple beside the nuclear device with the detached professionalism that combat veterans learned to cultivate. The younger man had stopped breathing, his gasping struggles finally ended by blood loss and shock. That left only Reeves, somewhere in the darkness with a weapon and the knowledge needed to prevent 8 million deaths. "Impressive," Reeves called out, his voice showing the first signs of stress. "You move like someone who's seen real combat. Somalia? Afghanistan? Iraq? We probably have mutual friends in the special operations community." Sarah didn't respond, using the sound of his voice to guide her movement toward the device itself. If she could reach the nuclear weapon, She might be able to study its construction while maintaining a defensive position against the remaining terrorist. You know what I learned during my tours overseas? Reeves continued. The American military is very good at breaking things, but terrible at understanding consequences. We can topple governments and eliminate insurgent networks, but we never seem to grasp that our actions create new problems that require new solutions. The device loomed before her, its timer display showing slightly different numbers than before. 3 hours and 1 minute on one screen, 4 hours and 37 minutes on another, and that flickering third display that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. This weapon represents a new kind of solution, Reeves said. Instead of projecting force overseas, it brings consequences home where they belong. The politicians who voted for these wars, the generals who planned them, the contractors who profited from them, they'll all share in the cost for once. Sarah studied the device's construction while listening for any sound that might indicate Reeves's position. The wiring was more complex than anything in her EOD training, with multiple redundant systems that could trigger detonation through various pathways. Even if she could identify the primary circuit, cutting it might simply activate one of the backup triggers. The timer mechanism is particularly elegant, Reeves continued, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions as it echoed through the chamber. 3 separate systems, each programmed with different activation schedules. Even if you successfully disable one, the others will continue counting down. And if you try to cut the wrong wire, he let the implication hang in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah's hands were steady as she traced the visible wiring with her flashlight beam, but her mind was racing through possibilities and probabilities. The device was more sophisticated than her training had prepared her for, a fusion of improvised construction and professional engineering that would challenge even the most experienced EOD specialists. And somewhere in the darkness, David Reeves was moving closer with his own weapon and his own desperate conviction that mass murder could somehow balance the moral scales of American foreign policy. The ticking continued, implacable and precise, marking the seconds until 8 million people discovered whether their lives depended on the steady hands and clear thinking of a woman whose own superiors questioned her ability to handle pressure. The silence in the chamber stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the mechanical ticking that had become the soundtrack to Sarah Chen's nightmare. She pressed herself against the cold metal of the device's outer casing, using its bulk as cover while her eyes strained to penetrate the darkness where David Reeves was hunting her with methodical patience. 3 bodies now lay scattered across the concrete floor of the underground laboratory. The younger terrorist had finally stopped breathing, his life seeping away among the scattered electronic components that had been meant to trigger Armageddon. The woman with the night vision goggles sprawled beside one of the workbenches, her weapon fallen from nerveless fingers. But their deaths had only eliminated the obvious threats, leaving Sarah alone with the mastermind who possessed both the knowledge to prevent her from disarming the device and the fanatical conviction to see his mission completed. Her damaged throat mic crackled with intermittent static, occasionally catching fragments of transmission from command. Double quotes. Per 1. Status: massive interference. Team standing by. The words were too broken to provide useful information, but they reminded her that somewhere above ground, Colonel Webb and his analysts were watching digital displays that showed her location as a blinking dot, surrounded by the electronic signature of nuclear death. "You're thinking about the wiring, aren't you?" Reeves's voice drifted from somewhere to her left, conversational and confident. "Trying to trace the circuits, identify the primary triggers, calculate which connections you can safely cut. I spent months designing those circuits specifically to frustrate that kind of analysis." Sarah said nothing, using the sound of his voice to guide her own movement while she studied the device's construction. Up close, the engineering was even more sophisticated than her initial assessment had suggested. The fusion core was surrounded by precisely machined components that spoke to access to classified technical specifications, while the electronics showed the kind of redundant design philosophy that characterized military weapons systems. Each timer system operates independently, Reeves continued, his voice seeming to echo from multiple directions as he moved through the shadows. The first one controls the primary detonation sequence, traditional chemical explosives that compress the fissile material to critical density. The second system manages the fusion reaction itself, precisely timing the injection of deuterium and tritium to maximize yield. And the third, he paused for effect. The third system is my personal insurance policy. A chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature ran down Sarah's spine. Insurance policy suggested something beyond simple redundancy, an additional layer of complexity that would make disarming the device exponentially more difficult. If anyone attempts to interfere with the primary systems, Reeves explained, the third timer immediately triggers detonation. No warning, no opportunity for second chances. The slightest disturbance to the wrong component will vaporize everything within a 20-mile radius in less than a second. The technical challenge was becoming clearer, and with it, the magnitude of what she was facing. This wasn't just a sophisticated nuclear weapon, it was a psychological weapon, designed to paralyze anyone who attempted to disarm it. Every wire could be the wrong wire, every component a potential trigger for immediate annihilation. You're wondering how I know so much about nuclear weapons design, Reeves said, his position shifting again as he maintained tactical awareness while delivering his monologue. 15 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in weapons systems and demolitions. I've worked on everything from battlefield nuclear devices to strategic warheads in underground silos. The government spent millions training me to understand these systems, and now I'm using that knowledge to hold them accountable. Sarah found herself thinking about her sister Maya, probably spending her Saturday morning at one of Emma's soccer games or Jake's t-ball practice. Normal family activities in suburban Maryland, less than 15 miles from their current location. If this device detonated, Maya and the kids would be within the immediate kill radius, vaporized before they even realized something was wrong. The thought triggered a flash of anger that threatened to override her tactical discipline. These weren't enemy combatants in a foreign war zone. They were American families going about their weekend routines, unaware that their lives hung in the balance of decisions being made in a forgotten corner of the city's underground. The beautiful irony, Reeves continued, is that your superiors probably chose you for this mission because they thought a woman would be more cautious, more careful with the delicate work of bomb disposal. But caution won't save you here. The only way to disarm this device is through decisive action based on complete understanding of its construction. And you don't have enough time to gain that understanding. Sarah's training had covered psychological warfare, the deliberate use of verbal manipulation to destabilize an opponent's mental state. Reeves was trying to plant seeds of doubt about her abilities, hoping to trigger the kind of panic that would lead to fatal mistakes. She forced herself to focus on the observable facts, the device's physical construction, the visible wiring, patterns, the electronic signatures that her handheld scanner was detecting. The primary timer showed 2 hours and 47 minutes remaining. The secondary system indicated 4 hours and 12 minutes. But the third display continued its erratic flickering, showing numbers that seemed to shift too rapidly for human comprehension. Without understanding its function, any attempt to disarm the other systems could trigger whatever fail-safe mechanism Reeves had engineered into his doomsday device. I spent 18 months planning this operation, Reeves said, his voice taking on the quality of a lecture delivered to military students. Studying the target area, identifying optimal placement for maximum psychological impact, calculating blast effects and radiation dispersal patterns. Do you know what the hardest part was? Sarah moved carefully around the device's perimeter, her flashlight revealing new details with each angle of observation. The shipping container had been modified with precision cuts that suggested access to industrial machining equipment. The internal components were mounted on shock-absorbing frameworks that could survive significant movement or impact. This device had been designed for transportation and deployment in hostile environments. The hardest part was acquiring the nuclear material itself, Reeves continued. Weapons-grade uranium is surprisingly difficult to obtain, even for someone with my security clearances and technical background. But plutonium is everywhere if you know where to look. Medical isotopes from cancer treatment facilities, research materials from university laboratories, industrial sources from power plant operations. It just takes patience and planning to accumulate enough for a viable weapon. The implications were terrifying. If Reeves could construct one nuclear device from improvised materials, others could follow his example. The technical knowledge was available in scientific literature. The components could be acquired through legitimate channels, and the engineering challenges could be solved by anyone with sufficient education and motivation. Sarah's earpiece crackled with another fragment of transmission from command. Nuclear emergency response. Evacuation zones. NEST teams. The words were too distorted to understand completely, but they suggested that decision-makers above ground were preparing for the possibility of failure. NEST, the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, represented the government's best hope for dealing with nuclear terrorism, but their specialists were trained for different scenarios. Known weapon designs, conventional construction techniques, standard approaches to bomb disposal. They wouldn't be any better equipped to handle Reeves's improvised engineering than Sarah was. The government will try to evacuate the city, Reeves said, apparently monitoring the same communications channels. But they don't have enough time or resources to move 8 million people to safety. The highways will become parking lots, the airports will be overwhelmed, and the rail systems will collapse under the demand. Most people will still be sitting in traffic when the device detonates. Sarah could visualize the chaos, millions of people receiving emergency alerts on their phones, families packing whatever they could carry, highways clogged with vehicles moving at walking speed while precious time ticked away. The logistics of evacuating a major metropolitan area were staggering under the best circumstances. With only hours of warning, the operation would become a humanitarian disaster even if the bomb never exploded. But you know what the real beauty of this situation is? Reeves's voice had moved closer, somewhere behind the scaffolding that supported the device. Even if you somehow manage to disarm the nuclear component, I've prepared additional surprises. Throughout the tunnel system, conventional explosives rigged to collapse the entire underground network, trapping rescue teams and spreading radioactive contamination through the subway infrastructure. Sarah felt the walls of the chamber pressing in around her as the full scope of Reeves's plan became clear. This wasn't just an attempt to detonate a nuclear weapon. It was a comprehensive attack designed to maximize casualties, spread contamination, and cripple the government's ability to respond effectively. She thought about the bodies she had discovered during her approach to the chamber. Agent Torres, Sergeant Washington, Dr. Foster, all experienced professionals who had been eliminated before they could understand the true nature of the threat they were facing. Their deaths weren't just tactical necessities from Reeves's perspective, but deliberate attempts to deprive the government of the expertise needed to counter his operation. The advance team found some of my preparations, Reeves continued, his voice carrying a note of professional pride. Dr. Foster was particularly insightful about the radiation shielding, but she never understood the real elegance of the design. Each subsystem is designed to function independently, but they're also interconnected through fiber optic cables that run throughout the tunnel network. Sarah's blood chilled as she processed the implications. Fiber optic connections meant the device could receive external commands, potentially triggering detonation from anywhere in the city. Even if she successfully neutralized Reeves and his remaining followers, The weapon could still be activated remotely by Confederates she had never identified. "You're beginning to understand," Reeves said, apparently reading her silence correctly. "This isn't a lone wolf operation that ends when you put a bullet in my head. I have associates throughout the metropolitan area, each with the capability to trigger detonation if the primary mission is compromised." The psychological pressure was becoming almost unbearable. Every solution Sarah considered seemed to create new problems, additional layers of complexity that moved the successful resolution of the crisis further beyond her capabilities. She found herself thinking about the evaluation reports that had questioned her ability to handle extreme stress, wondering if the military psychologists had been correct about her limitations. But then her grandfather's compass pressed against her chest as she shifted position, reminding her of his stories about the siege of Kherson. The thing about impossible situations, he had told her during one of their last conversations before his death, is that they only stay impossible until someone figures out how to make them possible. The trick is to keep thinking clearly when everyone else is panicking. Sarah forced herself to focus on the observable facts rather than the overwhelming magnitude of the threat. The device had 3 timer systems, each with different countdown schedules. The primary system showed 2 hours and 34 minutes remaining. The secondary indicated 4 hours and 3 minutes. But the third display continued its erratic flickering, cycling through numbers too rapidly to read. "The third timer is keyed to my biometric signature," Reeves said, apparently deciding to reveal more details about his engineering. "Heart rate, body temperature, breathing pattern. It monitors my vital signs through a wireless connection to sensors I'm wearing. If anything happens to me, if my biometrics fall outside normal parameters, the device triggers immediately." A dead man switch tied to physiological monitoring. Sarah had seen similar systems during her training, but never in a nuclear context. The implications were staggering. Killing Reeves would guarantee detonation, but leaving him alive meant dealing with an opponent who held the ultimate trump card. "You're trapped in a perfect strategic dilemma," Reeves continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a chess master announcing checkmate. "Any aggressive action triggers immediate detonation. Any attempt to disarm the device without proper authorization codes triggers immediate detonation. And in less than 3 hours, the primary timer reaches 0 regardless of human intervention." Sarah's training had covered similar scenarios during her advanced tactical courses, but always in theoretical contexts that didn't include the lives of 8 million innocent people. The military solution would be to accept the tactical situation, withdraw to a safe distance, and allow the weapon to detonate while minimizing collateral damage through evacuation and containment procedures. But there was no safe distance from a nuclear weapon in a metropolitan area, and no evacuation plan that could move 8 million people to safety in less than 3 hours. The military solution would result in the largest civilian casualty count in American history, transforming the nation's capital into a radioactive wasteland that would remain uninhabitable for decades. "I can see you thinking," Reeves said, his voice closer now, somewhere behind the device itself. "Running through your tactical options, trying to find a solution that doesn't result in mass casualties. But there isn't one. The only choice you have is how many people die, everyone in the blast radius, or everyone in the blast radius plus whoever gets killed when you try to be a hero." The steady ticking seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the device could sense the psychological pressure building in the chamber. Sarah found herself counting the intervals between ticks, using the rhythm to steady her breathing and maintain her tactical awareness while her conscious mind grappled with problems that seemed to have no solutions. Movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention, a shadow shifting behind one of the workbenches, too large and deliberate to be a trick of the light. Reeves was repositioning himself, maintaining tactical advantage while he delivered his psychological warfare. But the movement also revealed something she hadn't noticed before: Additional wiring that didn't connect to the nuclear device itself. Following the cables with her eyes, Sarah identified connections that led to other parts of the chamber. Small devices mounted near the ceiling, components hidden among this scattered equipment, electronics that weren't part of the main weapon but seemed designed to serve supporting functions. "You found the secondary charges," Reeves said, apparently following her gaze through night vision equipment. 20 pounds of C4 plastic explosive, positioned to collapse this chamber and seal the tunnel system if anyone attempts unauthorized access to the device. They're tied to the same biometric monitoring system, so any attempt to harm me triggers a cave-in that buries everything under tons of concrete and steel. The secondary charges explained the bodies she had found during her approach, not just execution victims, but casualties of a defensive system designed to eliminate anyone who came too close to understanding Reeves's operation. Dr. Foster and her team had probably triggered motion sensors or pressure plates that alerted the terrorists to their presence, leading to the ambush that left them dead in the tunnels. Sarah's earpiece crackled again, this time with clearer reception. "Viper 1, this is Command. We're reading multiple electronic signatures from your location. Please confirm status and provide tactical assessment." She keyed her throat mic carefully, aware that any transmission could be monitored by Reeves's equipment. "Command, I've located the primary objective and eliminated 2 hostiles. 1 remaining subject with detailed knowledge of the device's construction. Multiple timer systems with conflicting activation schedules. The situation is complex." "Roger, Viper 1. We're monitoring the electronic signatures. Nest teams are standing by for technical support, and evacuation procedures are being implemented throughout the metropolitan area. What's your assessment of disarmament viability?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah looked at the device with its maze of wiring, redundant systems, and biometric failsafes, then considered the additional challenges posed by secondary charges and remote activation capabilities. By any rational assessment, the disarmament was beyond her capabilities or those of anyone else who might be deployed to replace her. But rational assessments didn't account for the 8 million people who would die if she failed, or the precedent that would be set if domestic terrorists could successfully detonate nuclear weapons in American cities. Sometimes rational assessments had to be set aside in favor of desperate measures and impossible hopes. "Command, the device is more sophisticated than intelligence indicated. Multiple redundant systems, biometric failsafes, and remote activation capabilities. Standard disarmament. Procedures won't be effective." She paused, watching Reeves's shadow move behind the scaffolding. "But I'm continuing the mission." "Negative, Viper 1. If the device can't be disarmed, you need to extract immediately. We can't lose our only asset on site for a mission that—" Sarah switched off her throat mic, cutting the transmission before Webb could complete his order to withdraw. She understood the tactical logic, the need to preserve trained personnel for future operations. But she also understood that there might not be future operations if Reeves succeeded in his mission. "Wise choice," Reeves called out, apparently monitoring her communications. "Your colonel is thinking like a soldier, focused on preserving assets and minimizing losses. But this situation requires thinking beyond conventional military doctrine." Sarah began moving around the device's perimeter again, studying the wiring from different angles while maintaining awareness of Reeves's position. The construction was brilliant in its complexity, each subsystem designed to function independently, while remaining vulnerable to interference from the others. It was the kind of engineering challenge that would normally require days of analysis and planning to solve safely. "The irony is that I actually hope you succeed," Reeves said, his voice taking on a more philosophical tone. "Not because I want to survive, but because stopping this device would prove that American military personnel are capable of the kind of innovation and dedication that our foreign policy has been lacking. Sarah found herself listening despite her tactical training, intrigued by the contradiction between Reeves's actions and his apparent motivation. He had constructed a weapon of mass destruction and murdered federal agents, but he spoke like someone who still believed in American ideals, albeit through a twisted lens of vengeance and retribution. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Reeves continued, "watching young soldiers die for objectives that changed every 6 months. Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, countless smaller operations that never made the news, all launched by politicians who never wore a uniform and planned by generals who hadn't seen combat since the Cold War." The personal nature of his grievances was becoming clearer, transforming him from a faceless terrorist into a fallen soldier who had been broken by experiences that Sarah recognized from her own deployments. The psychological profile in his classified file had mentioned acute combat stress reaction and survivor guilt related to unit casualties, but the clinical language had failed to convey the human cost of prolonged exposure to warfare. "But you know what really convinced me that the system was beyond reform?" Reeves asked, his shadow shifting again as he moved to maintain visual contact. "It was coming home to Arlington National Cemetery, walking past the graves of people I had served with, and realizing that their deaths had accomplished nothing meaningful. The Taliban was still fighting, Iraqi insurgents were still bombing markets, and American politicians were still making the same mistakes that got my friends killed." Sarah understood the emotional logic even as she rejected the conclusion. Military service inevitably involved exposure to senseless tragedy, random death, and the kind of moral complexity that civilian populations rarely confronted. But using that pain to justify mass murder represented a fundamental betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to represent. "This device represents accountability," Reeves said, his voice carrying the fervor of absolute conviction. "For the first time in decades, American political leaders will face the same kind of consequences that they've been imposing on other countries. Their families will be at risk, their homes will be threatened, and their survival will depend on decisions made by people who understand the real cost of violence." The ticking continued, marking time with mechanical precision while Sarah wrestled with tactical problems that seemed designed to defeat any possible solution. 2 hours and 19 minutes on the primary timer. 3 hours and 48 minutes on the secondary system. And the third display flickering through numbers that might represent anything from backup activation codes to random electronic noise. "Time is becoming a factor," Reeves observed, apparently checking his own monitoring equipment. "Even if you could somehow bypass the biometric failsafes and decode the electronic protection systems, you'd need hours to safely disarm each component, and we don't have hours." Sarah's grandfather's compass seemed to grow heavier against her chest, reminding her of conversations about courage under fire and the importance of doing what was right regardless of personal cost. He had carried that compass through 2 tours in Vietnam, including the siege of Khe Sanh, where surrounded Marines had held their position against overwhelming odds for 77 days. "The thing about impossible situations," she whispered to herself, repeating his words like a prayer, "is that they only stay impossible until someone figures out how to make them possible." She began studying the device with fresh eyes, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal vulnerabilities in Reeves's sophisticated engineering. Somewhere in the maze of wiring and electronics, there had to be a solution that didn't require hours of careful analysis or detailed knowledge of nuclear weapons physics. The answer, when it came to her, was so simple that she almost dismissed it as wishful thinking. But the more she considered the implications, the more convinced she became that Reeves had made one crucial mistake in his otherwise brilliant design. "You've been thinking," Reeves said, apparently sensing the change in her demeanor. "I can practically hear the gears turning in your head. But whatever solution you think you've found, I guarantee it's more complicated than you realize. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the underground chamber, feeling the cold weight of tactical certainty settling over her like armor. She had found something that Reeves's engineering brilliance had overlooked, a vulnerability that could be exploited without triggering his elaborate, fail-safe systems. The question was whether she had enough time to implement her solution before the primary timer reached 0, and whether her nerve would hold when the moment came to bet 8 million lives on a theory that existed only in her head. The ticking continued, steady and implacable, counting down to a moment that would determine whether Sarah Chen's name would be remembered as the woman who saved Washington or forgotten among the 8 million casualties of the largest terrorist attack in American history. But her solution required getting closer to the device, close enough to implement a plan that would either save 8 million lives or trigger the immediate death of everyone within 20 miles of downtown Washington. And between her and the nuclear weapon stood David Reeves, a broken soldier with nothing left to lose and every reason to prevent her from succeeding. Sarah checked her weapon and began moving toward the device, her boots finding silent purchase on the concrete floor as she prepared to bet everything on a theory that could only be tested once. In the darkness behind the scaffolding, Reeves was waiting with his own weapon and his absolute conviction that mass murder could somehow balance the moral scales of American foreign policy. The timer displays continued their countdown, marking seconds and minutes until a moment that would change everything or nothing, depending on decisions about to be made by people who had run out of alternatives and were rapidly running out of time. 2 hours and 14 minutes until primary detonation. 3 hours and 43 minutes until secondary activation. And somewhere in the flickering chaos of the third display, numbers that might hold the key to salvation or destruction, Sarah's grandfather's compass pressed against her chest as she moved forward, carrying with it the accumulated weight of family, tradition, military honor, and the desperate hope that courage could overcome engineering when the stakes were high enough and the alternatives were unacceptable. The ticking grew louder as she approached the device, each sound echoing in her chest like a second heartbeat that counted down to a moment when 8 million lives would depend on the steady hands and clear thinking of a woman whose own superiors had questioned her ability to handle pressure. Doubt was a luxury she could no longer afford. In the next few minutes, Sarah Chen would either prove that American military training could overcome any challenge, or become another casualty in a war that had followed her home from foreign battlefields to the underground tunnels beneath her nation's capital. Sarah's plan crystallized as she studied the device from her new position, the solution emerging from the intersection of her technical training and her understanding of human psychology. Reeves had constructed a masterpiece of engineering paranoia, with redundant systems and biometric fail-safes that would defeat any conventional disarmament attempt. But in his obsession with preventing technical interference, he had overlooked a fundamental vulnerability that lay not in the device's electronics, but in the man who had created it, the biometric monitoring system that prevented anyone from harming Reeves was also his greatest weakness. If his heart rate, breathing, or body temperature fell outside normal parameters, the device would detonate immediately. But what constituted normal for a man under extreme stress in a combat situation? And what would happen if those parameters could be manipulated gradually, subtly, in ways that wouldn't trigger the fail-safe mechanisms? "You're thinking about the biometric system," Reeves called out, his voice carrying a note of amusement. "Wondering if there's some way to trick the sensors or interfere with the monitoring. But I designed those safeguards specifically to prevent that kind of manipulation." Sarah said nothing, continuing her careful movement around the device's perimeter, while her mind worked through the technical and tactical challenges ahead. The biometric sensors would be monitoring Reeves's vital signs continuously, establishing baselines and adjusting to normal fluctuations caused by physical activity or emotional stress. But every monitoring system had limitations, threshold values, that defined the boundaries between normal and abnormal physiological states. The sensors are military grade, Reeves continued, apparently confident enough in his engineering to reveal additional details. Designed for battlefield conditions, capable of distinguishing between combat stress and genuine medical emergencies. They've been calibrated specifically to my physiological profile, accounting for everything from my resting heart rate to my response patterns under extreme pressure. But calibration implied programmable parameters, and programmable parameters could potentially be influenced through external factors that the system's designers hadn't anticipated. Sarah began cataloging everything she knew about biometric monitoring, from her training in survival and resistance techniques to her experience with medical equipment during combat casualty care. The human body was remarkably adaptable, capable of adjusting to extreme conditions through unconscious physiological responses. Heart rate could be influenced by breathing patterns, body temperature by environmental factors, stress responses by psychological manipulation. If she could gradually introduce changes that fell within the system's tolerance parameters, she might be able to create a situation where Reeves's vital signs would trigger the failsafe without the system recognizing the artificial nature of the manipulation. "I can practically hear you thinking," Reeves said, his voice closer now as he moved to maintain visual contact. "But whatever plan you're formulating, you need to understand that I've spent months testing these systems. Every possible failure mode has been anticipated and addressed." Sarah's earpiece crackled with another transmission from command. The signal, stronger now as communication equipment above ground was reconfigured to penetrate the underground interference. "Viper 1, this is Colonel Webb. We're showing massive electromagnetic disturbance from your location, and the NEST teams are reporting readings consistent with an active nuclear device. What's your current status?" She keyed her throat mic briefly, aware that any extended transmission would reveal her position to Reeves's monitoring equipment. "Command, I've identified potential vulnerabilities in the target's fail-safe systems. Continuing mission." "Negative, Viper 1. Evacuation procedures are 90% complete, but we need 12 more hours to fully clear the blast radius. If you can't neutralize the threat in the next hour, you need to extract immediately. 12 hours to evacuate 8 million people." Sarah understood the impossible logistics involved, the highways clogged with vehicles moving at walking speed, the airports overwhelmed with passengers trying to flee the city, the rail systems collapsing under demand that exceeded their capacity by orders of magnitude. Most people would still be sitting in traffic when the device detonated, trapped in their cars as the fireball expanded across the metropolitan area. "Your colonel is lying," Reeves said, apparently monitoring the same communications frequencies. 12 hours is a fantasy number designed to keep you motivated. The actual evacuation time for a metropolitan area this size is closer to 36 hours, assuming perfect coordination and no panic-induced traffic disruptions. Most of the population will be within the blast radius when this device activates. The psychological pressure was becoming almost unbearable, each new revelation adding layers of complexity that pushed the successful resolution of the crisis further beyond Sarah's capabilities. But she forced herself to focus on the elements she could control, the tactical problems that could be solved through proper application of training and determination. The device's construction included environmental monitoring systems that measured temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure in the surrounding chamber. Those sensors were necessary to ensure optimal conditions for the nuclear reaction, but they also provided Sarah with information about the microenvironment that Reeves's biometric monitors were operating within. She began moving more deliberately, using her body heat and breathing to gradually change the thermal characteristics of the air around the device. The changes were subtle, barely measurable by human senses, but sensitive electronic equipment would detect the variations and potentially incorporate them into the baseline calculations that determine normal operating parameters. Clever, Reeves sighed, his voice carrying genuine admiration. You're trying to gradually shift the environmental baselines so that the monitoring system recalibrates its tolerance parameters. But the sensors are designed to compensate for exactly that kind of manipulation. Sarah continued her systematic movement, creating air currents and thermal variations, while her mind worked through the next phase of her plan. Environmental manipulation alone wouldn't be sufficient to trigger the fail-safe systems, but it might create conditions that would amplify the effects of more direct psychological intervention. "Tell me something," she called out, breaking her tactical silence for the first time since entering the chamber. "How many of your friends died in Afghanistan?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, designed to probe the emotional wounds that had transformed David Reeves from a decorated military engineer into a domestic terrorist. His psychological profile had mentioned survivor guilt related to unit casualties, but the clinical language hadn't conveyed the human cost of watching friends die in foreign wars. 37, Reeves replied after a long pause, his voice carrying a weight that suggested each death was still fresh in his memory. 37 good soldiers who trusted their government and their leaders, who believed they were fighting for something meaningful. 37 friends who died for objectives that changed every 6 months and strategies that never worked. Sarah could hear the pain in his voice, the kind of grief that came from surviving when others didn't, and wondering whether their deaths had served any purpose, beyond advancing political careers and defense contractor profits. She had felt similar emotions after losing teammates in Somalia, the crushing weight of survivor guilt that made her question every decision that had led to her being alive when better soldiers were dead. Sergeant Michael Torres, not related to the FBI agent, died when his convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar. Reeves continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a memorial service. He was 23 years old, married for 8 months, and planning to use his GI Bill benefits to study engineering when he got home. The bomb that killed him was built by insurgents using explosives we had provided to Afghan security forces. The irony was bitter and familiar to anyone who had served in the Middle East, where weapons and equipment regularly found their way from Allied forces to enemy hands through corruption, incompetence, or simple battlefield chaos. Sarah had seen similar situations during her own deployments, watching American-made munitions being used against American soldiers by enemies who had acquired them through labyrinthine supply chains that no one fully understood. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh died during a rocket attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. Reeves continued, his voice growing more intense as he relived each tragedy. 27 years old, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 tour in Afghanistan. The rockets that killed her were Iranian-made, supplied to Taliban forces as part of a proxy war that our intelligence agencies had been tracking for years, but our political leaders chose to ignore. Sarah could sense the psychological pressure building in Reeves's voice, the accumulated weight of grief and rage that had ultimately broken his faith in the military system he had served for 15 years. She began incorporating this emotional vulnerability into her tactical plan, using his own pain as a weapon against the biometric systems that protected his doomsday device. And Captain Robert Chun, no relation to you, I assume died when his helicopter was shot down during a medical evacuation mission near Helmand Province, Reeves said, his voice cracking slightly on the name. 31 years old, a West Point graduate who had turned down lucrative civilian job offers to continue serving his country. The shoulder-fired missile that brought down his aircraft was manufactured in Pakistan and sold to the Taliban through networks that our allies were supposed to be monitoring. The repetitive nature of the losses was what made them so psychologically devastating, Sarah realized. Not single traumatic events that could be processed and overcome, but a systematic pattern of senseless deaths that accumulated over months and years until they became an unbearable weight on the conscience of anyone who cared about the people under their command. "How many people have you killed?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through his recitation of the dead like a blade. Not enemy combatants in legitimate military operations, but innocent civilians who happened to be in the wrong place when your engineering projects were completed. The question was calculated to shift Reeves's emotional state from grief to anger, triggering physiological responses that might affect his biometric readings. But it was also genuinely curious. She wanted to understand how someone who mourned the deaths of fellow soldiers could justify the mass murder of civilians who had never participated in the wars that had broken his faith. "None," Reeves replied. After a long pause, his voice defensive. "Every project I worked on was designed to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing military effectiveness. Precision munitions, targeted demolitions, surgical strikes that eliminated specific threats, without causing collateral damage." Sarah detected the note of professional pride in his voice, the engineer's satisfaction with technical achievements that had saved lives rather than taken them. But she also heard the underlying contradiction. If his military service had been focused on protecting civilians, how could he justify a weapon that would kill 8 million innocent people? "But you're about to murder more civilians than any terrorist in American history," she pointed out, allowing her voice to carry the moral weight of the accusation. 8 million people who never voted for the wars you disagree with, never profited from defense contracts, never made policy decisions that got your friends killed. How do you reconcile that with your service record? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, broken only by the mechanical ticking that marked time until detonation. Sarah could sense Reeves struggling with the contradiction, his psychological defenses working to maintain the cognitive framework that justified his actions. "They're not innocent," he finally replied, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "They're complicit in a system that treats military service as an acceptable cost for political ambitions. They vote for politicians who start wars. They buy products from companies that profit from defense contracts. They live comfortable lives while soldiers die in foreign countries to protect their interests." Sarah could hear the rationalization in his voice, the desperate attempt to maintain moral justification for actions that he understood were fundamentally wrong. She pressed the psychological advantage, using his own ethical framework against him. "So 6-year-old Emma Chun in Bethesda is complicit in foreign policy decisions?" she asked, deliberately using her own niece's name to personalize the abstract concept of civilian casualties. 4-year-old Jake is responsible for defense contractor profits? They're not even old enough to understand what war means, but they deserve to die because adults made choices they had no part in? The biometric monitoring systems would be detecting Reeves's stress responses: now elevated heart rate, increased breathing, rising body temperature caused by emotional agitation. If Sarah could maintain the psychological pressure while gradually escalating the environmental factors she had been manipulating, she might be able to create a cascade effect that would trigger the fail-safe mechanisms without the system recognizing the artificial nature of the stimuli. "Children are always casualties of war," Reeves said, but his voice had become uncertain, defensive. "Dresden, Hiroshima, Baghdad, Kabul civilian populations pay the price for their government's decisions. This weapon will finally bring that reality home to the people who have been insulated from the consequences of American foreign policy." Sarah could sense the psychological cracks in his justification, the places where his moral framework was breaking down under the weight of its own contradictions. She began moving closer to the device, using her proximity to increase the environmental pressure on his monitoring systems while maintaining the emotional assault on his psychological defenses. "But Dresden and Hiroshima were military targets during active wars," she pointed out. "Baghdad and Kabul were occupied by armies that had invaded other countries. Washington is full of civilians going about their weekend routines, completely unaware that their government is fighting wars in their name. How is that comparable? The question struck at the heart of Reeves's rationalization, forcing him to confront the fundamental difference between legitimate military targets and innocent civilian populations. Sarah could hear his breathing becoming more labored, his voice showing strain as he struggled to maintain his psychological equilibrium. "The government represents the people," he said, but the conviction was draining from his voice. "Democratic societies are responsible for the actions of their elected leaders. If Americans wanted to stop fighting foreign wars, they would vote for politicians who shared that commitment." Sarah pressed her advantage, sensing that his psychological defenses were beginning to collapse under the accumulated pressure of environmental manipulation and moral contradiction. And what about the people who did vote against those wars? What about the protesters who opposed military intervention, the activists who campaigned for peace, the soldiers who came home and spoke out against the policies that got their friends killed? The biometric sensors would be registering significant deviations from Reeves's normal physiological parameters now, but the changes had been introduced gradually enough that the system might not recognize them as artificial manipulation. Sarah continued her approach toward the device, using her presence to create additional environmental pressure, while maintaining the psychological assault that was breaking down his emotional defenses. "This isn't about justice," she continued, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had served in the same wars that had broken Reeves's faith. "This is about revenge against people who were never your enemies. You're not targeting the politicians who started those wars, or the generals who planned them, or the contractors who profited from them. You're targeting families and children, and teachers and nurses who happen to live in the same city as the government you blame for your friends' deaths." Reeves's breathing was becoming audibly labored now, his stress responses clearly elevated beyond normal parameters. But the biometric monitoring system continued to operate, suggesting that the changes remained within acceptable tolerance levels, despite the psychological pressure Sarah was applying. "They could have stopped it," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "If enough people had cared about military casualties, if they had demanded accountability from their representatives, if they had made foreign policy a priority in elections, my friends would still be alive." Sarah could hear the grief breaking through his anger, the fundamental pain that had driven his transformation from decorated soldier to domestic terrorist. But grief didn't justify mass murder, and she pressed that point with relentless logic. "And killing 8 million innocent people will bring them back?" she asked. "Will vaporizing children and families and elderly people somehow resurrect Sergeant Torres or Staff Sergeant Walsh or Captain Chen? Or will it just add 8 million more names to the list of people who died for reasons they never understood?" The silence that followed was different from his previous pauses, heavy with the weight of moral recognition, rather than tactical calculation. Sarah could sense that her psychological assault was having the desired effect, breaking down the rationalization that allowed Reeves to maintain his conviction that mass murder could be justified as political protest, but breaking his psychological defenses wasn't sufficient to disarm the device. She needed to create a situation where his physiological responses would trigger the fail-safe systems while appearing to be natural stress reactions rather than artificial manipulation. And she was running out of time to implement a solution. That depended on precise timing and perfect execution. The timer displays showed 1 hour and 47 minutes until primary detonation, 3 hours and 21 minutes until secondary activation. And the third system continued its erratic flickering, cycling through numbers that might represent backup protocols or random electronic noise. Sarah's grandfather's compass seemed to grow heavier against her chest as she prepared for the most dangerous phase of her plan. In the next few minutes, she would either prove that psychological warfare could overcome technological sophistication, or trigger the immediate death of 8 million people through a miscalculation that would make her the greatest mass murderer in American history. But doubt was a luxury she could no longer afford. The ticking continued, marking seconds until a moment when everything would change. And Sarah Chen had to bet her life and the lives of 8 million others on a theory that existed only in her understanding of human psychology and electronic engineering. The radiation hit Sarah like an invisible wave of heat and nausea, her body's cellular structure beginning to break down at the molecular level as she reached into the shielded compartment. Her dosimeter was clicking so rapidly that individual counts blurred into a continuous electronic scream, measuring exposure levels that would have triggered immediate evacuation protocols in any normal situation. But this was far from normal. Sarah's hands found the blue-coated deuterium line first, following Reeves's instructions to locate the manual shutoff valve that would interrupt the nuclear fuel feed. The valve was smaller than she had expected, requiring precise finger movements that were already becoming more difficult as radiation began affecting her nervous system. "Deuterium valve first," she called out, her voice steady despite the nausea building in her stomach. "Then tritium, then manual separation of the fusion core." "Roger," Reeves replied, his voice tense with concentration as he monitored his own vital signs to prevent triggering the biometric fail-safes. "The deuterium valve requires a quarter-turn counterclockwise. Too far, and you'll rupture the containment system." Sarah's hands were beginning to shake slightly as the radiation exposure affected her fine motor control, but years of weapons training had taught her to function despite physical stress. She gripped the valve carefully, applying gentle pressure in the direction Reeves had specified. The valve turned smoothly, and she felt the pressure change as deuterium flow ceased. One system down, 2 to go. But her radiation detector was registering exposure levels that would prove fatal within hours, regardless of medical intervention, and she could feel the effects beginning to compromise her physical capabilities. "Tritium system is red-coded," Reeves continued, his technical training providing a lifeline of precision in the chaos of nuclear disarmament. "Same procedure, quarter-turn counterclockwise, but this valve is more sensitive. Too much pressure will cause immediate containment failure." Sarah located the red line, her vision beginning to blur slightly as radiation affected her optic nerves. The tritium valve was indeed more delicate than its deuterium counterpart, requiring even finer motor control at a time when her hands were becoming increasingly unsteady. She took a deep breath, focusing all her concentration on the precise movements required to shut off the tritium feed without triggering containment failure. The valve resisted her initial pressure, then suddenly gave way with a soft click that indicated successful closure. "Both fuel systems are now offline," she reported, her voice beginning to show the strain of radiation exposure. "What's the procedure for manual separation of the fusion core?" "There's a mechanical coupling system at the base of the fusion chamber," Reeves explained, his own voice tight with stress as he monitored both her progress and his own biometric readings. "You'll see 4 heavy-duty clamps that secure the fusion core to the fission trigger. They have to be released simultaneously, or the asymmetric pressure will cause premature detonation." Sarah peered deeper into the shielded compartment, her flashlight revealing the coupling system Reeves had described. 4 massive clamps surrounded a cylindrical chamber that contained the fusion core, each one marked with warning labels in multiple languages. The engineering was sophisticated even by military standards, designed to contain forces that could reshape matter at the atomic level. But the clamps were positioned in a way that would require her to reach deeper into the radiation field, exposing her torso and head to even higher levels of nuclear contamination. Her dosimeter's clicking had become so rapid that it sounded like static, measuring exposure that was accumulating faster than her body could process. "I can't reach all 4 clamps simultaneously," she called out, her voice beginning to slur slightly as radiation affected her speech centers. Going to have to release them in sequence and hope the timing is close enough. Negative, Reeves replied urgently. Sequential release will create asymmetric pressure that triggers detonation. You need to find a way to release all 4 clamps within a 2-second window. Sarah studied the mechanical system more closely, understanding that she was facing an engineering challenge that required precise coordination at a time when her physical capabilities were rapidly declining. The radiation exposure was approaching levels that would cause immediate incapacitation, but she had to complete the disarmament sequence before her body failed completely. An idea occurred to her as she examined the clamp release mechanisms. Each clamp was controlled by a spring-loaded lever that required approximately 20 pounds of pressure to activate. If she could find a way to apply simultaneous pressure to all 4 levers, she might be able to release the clamps within the required time window. "I'm going to try something," she announced, pulling her tactical belt from around her waist. The heavy leather and metal assemblage weighed approximately 15 pounds and could potentially serve as a crude tool for applying simultaneous pressure to multiple release levers. She positioned the belt across all 4 clamp releases, using the buckle and equipment attachments to create multiple pressure points. It was an improvised solution that would have made her engineering instructors cringe. But desperate situations required desperate measures. "On my mark," she called out, preparing to apply her body weight to the belt in a way that would hopefully trigger all 4 releases simultaneously. "This either works or we find out what a nuclear explosion looks like from ground zero." "Wait," Reeves called out urgently. "Before you try that, you should know the fusion core separation will cause a massive electromagnetic pulse. Every electronic system within 50 miles will be disabled, including the biometric monitoring that's keeping me alive. The moment you release those clamps, the fail-safe system will trigger, because it won't be able to monitor my vital signs." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the final cruel irony of Reeves's engineering. Even successful disarmament of the fusion system would trigger the fail-safe mechanisms designed to prevent tampering. She could save 8 million people from nuclear death, only to kill them through the backup systems that Reeves had installed as insurance against interference. "Is there any way to disable the biometric monitoring before I release the clamps?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Negative," Reeves replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "The monitoring system is hardened against MPAM and powered by independent batteries. It's designed to continue functioning even if every other electronic system fails." Sarah's mind raced through the tactical options, each one leading to the same conclusion. There was no technical solution that would allow her to disarm the fusion core without triggering the biometric failsafes. But technical solutions weren't the only possibilities. "David," she called out, using his first name deliberately. "What if your biometric readings showed that you had died of natural causes? Heart attack, stroke, some kind of medical event that wouldn't trigger the fail-safe systems." The silence that followed was heavy with implication as Reeves processed what she was suggesting. The biometric monitors were designed to detect external threats to his life, but they might not differentiate between murder and natural death if the physiological markers were sufficiently convincing. "It's possible," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone contemplating his own death. "The system is programmed to distinguish between medical emergencies and external threats. If my vital signs showed progressive organ failure consistent with natural causes, it might not trigger immediate detonation." Sarah's radiation exposure was reaching critical levels, her vision blurring and her hands shaking as cellular damage accumulated throughout her nervous system. She had minutes at most before the exposure would render her unable to complete the disarmament sequence. Regardless of any solutions they might develop, how do we simulate natural death? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would require Reeves to actually die rather than simply appear to die. "There are drugs that can simulate cardiac arrest Reeves replied, his technical knowledge extending to medical as well as engineering applications. But I don't have access to the right pharmaceuticals, and the timing would be too unpredictable. Anyway, Sarah could feel her strength beginning to fail as radiation poisoning progressed through the early stages of acute exposure. Nausea was building in her stomach, her coordination was becoming unreliable, and her vision was developing the kind of distortion that indicated damage to her optic nerves. But she had one final option, a solution that would require Reeves to make the ultimate sacrifice to prevent the catastrophe he had created. It was brutal in its simplicity and devastating in its implications, but it might be the only way to save 8 million innocent lives. "David," she called out, her voice becoming weaker as radiation exposure took its toll. "I need you to stop your own heart." The request hung in the chamber like a death sentence, brutal and necessary and absolutely final. Sarah was asking the man to commit suicide in order to prevent the mass murder he had planned, using his own death to defeat the safeguards he had engineered. "I understand," Reeves replied after a long pause, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral clarity. "It's the only way to prevent the fail-safe systems from triggering when you disarm the fusion core. I have to die for this to work." Sarah's hands were shaking violently now, radiation exposure affecting her motor control at a time when precision was absolutely critical. She had perhaps 2 or 3 minutes of functionality remaining before the cellular damage would incapacitate her completely. "How long does it take?" she asked, preparing to release the fusion core clamps the moment Reeves's biometric readings indicated natural death. "Carotid compression can cause unconsciousness in 10 to 15 seconds, Reeves replied, his medical knowledge providing the technical details of his own suicide. "Complete cardiac arrest follows within 2 to 3 minutes. The biometric system should read it as progressive organ failure rather than external trauma." Sarah positioned herself over the clamp release mechanism, her improvised belt tool ready to trigger simultaneous release of all 4 securing devices. The radiation exposure was approaching levels that would cause immediate incapacitation, but she forced herself to focus on the mechanical task ahead. "On your mark," she called out, understanding that she was about to witness a man's deliberate death in order to prevent mass murder. "I'll release the clamps the moment your biometrics show cardiac arrest." "Sarah," Reeves said, his voice carrying a strange peace that suggested he had found redemption in the decision to sacrifice his life for the people he had planned to murder. "Thank you for helping me find a way to make this right. Tell the families of my team that died in Afghanistan that their sacrifice meant something after all." Sarah heard the sound of movement as Reeves positioned his hands around his own throat, preparing to apply the pressure that would stop the blood flow to his brain and ultimately end his life. The biometric monitoring system registered the beginning of his physiological changes, elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, the stress responses that preceded deliberate self-destruction. "Initiating compression," Reeves announced, his voice already showing strain as he began applying pressure to his carotid arteries. 15 seconds to unconsciousness, 2 minutes to cardiac arrest. Sarah watched the biometric displays as Reeves's vital signs began changing in patterns consistent with progressive organ failure. His heart rate spiked initially, then began irregular patterns that indicated cardiovascular distress. Blood pressure readings fluctuated wildly as circulation became compromised. 10 seconds. Reeves's breathing became labored and irregular. 15 seconds. His vocalizations ceased as unconsciousness overtook him. 30 seconds. Heart rate became increasingly erratic as oxygen deprivation affected cardiac function. 1 minute. Complete loss of consciousness as brain function shut down. 90 seconds. Cardiac rhythm showing signs of progressive failure. 2 minutes. Complete cardiac arrest as Reeves's heart stopped beating permanently. The biometric monitoring system processed the physiological data, comparing it to patterns associated with natural death versus external trauma. The readings were consistent, with progressive cardiac failure, possibly triggered by extreme psychological stress, but fundamentally medical rather than violent in nature. No fail-safe activation. The system had interpreted Reeves's death as natural medical emergency rather than external threat, leaving the nuclear device vulnerable to manual disarmament without triggering backup detonation protocols. Sarah's hands were barely functional as radiation poisoning reached critical levels, but she managed to position her belt tool across all 4 clamp releases. Her vision was seriously compromised, her coordination failing, but she had one chance to complete the disarmament sequence before the radiation exposure rendered her completely incapacitated. "This is for everyone," she whispered to herself, thinking of her sister Maya and the kids, of 8 million innocent people going about their weekend routines, of David Reeves and his friends who had died in foreign wars, of all the casualties that violence created regardless of its justification. She threw her weight against the belt, applying simultaneous pressure to all 4 clamp releases. The mechanisms triggered within milliseconds of each other, close enough to prevent the asymmetric pressure that would cause premature detonation. The fusion core separated from the fission trigger with a mechanical click that seemed impossibly small for such a significant moment. The electromagnetic pulse that followed was massive but brief, disabling electronic systems throughout the metropolitan area but leaving the nuclear components inert and harmless. Sarah collapsed beside the disarmed device, her body finally succumbing to radiation exposure that had claimed her life even as she saved 8 million others. Her last conscious thought was of her grandfather's compass, still warm against her chest, a reminder that impossible situations only stayed impossible until someone figured out how to make them possible. The timer displays went dark. The mechanical ticking stopped, and in the silence that followed, 8 million people continued their weekend routines, unaware that they owed their lives to a woman who had proven that courage could overcome any engineering challenge. When human lives hung in the balance, Colonel Webb's voice crackled through emergency communications as rescue teams prepared to enter the tunnel system. "This is command. To all units. Electronic interference has ceased. Biometric signals are negative, and radiation levels are dropping to safe parameters. Viper 1 has completed the mission. Repeat, Viper 1 has completed the mission. Above ground, the city slowly returned to normal as evacuation orders were quietly lifted. Traffic resumed its usual weekend pace. Families returned to soccer games and shopping trips. Life continued because one woman had chosen to sacrifice everything when the stakes demanded nothing less. Colonel Webb's voice crackled through emergency communications as rescue teams prepared to enter the tunnel system. "This is command to all units. Electronic interference has ceased, biometric signals are negative, and radiation levels are dropping to safe parameters. Viper 1 has completed the mission. Repeat, Viper 1 has completed the mission." But Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen would never hear the confirmation of her success, or the gratitude of the 8 million people she had saved, or the recognition that would make her the most decorated hero in American military history. She had given everything to prove that impossible situations only stayed impossible until someone figured out how to make them possible. And her sacrifice had ensured that the nation's capital would see another sunrise. 3 days later, the morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Maya Chen stood beside a flag-draped casket, holding 6-year-old Emma's hand while 4-year-old Jake pressed against her leg. The funeral was unlike anything in military history, a ceremony for a hero whose actions had saved millions of lives, but whose sacrifice could never be fully understood by the people she had died to protect. Colonel Marcus Webb delivered the eulogy with military precision that couldn't disguise his personal grief. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen exemplified the highest traditions of military service. he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of dignitaries, fellow service members, and grateful civilians. When faced with an impossible situation, she chose to make it possible through courage, determination, and the ultimate sacrifice. The crowd was massive, stretching beyond the formal ceremony to include thousands of people who had come to pay their respects to a woman they had never met, but whose actions had allowed them to see another day. Families with children, elderly couples, young professionals, students, all representatives of the 8 million lives that had been preserved through Sarah's sacrifice. Maya had learned the truth about her sister's work 3 days earlier when Webb had arrived at her door in dress uniform to deliver news that shattered every assumption she had held about Sarah's logistics and transportation career. The classified nature of the mission meant that most details would never be revealed. But Maya understood enough to know that her little sister had died preventing the largest terrorist attack in American history. The investigation into the terrorist network is ongoing, Webb continued, his words carefully chosen to avoid revealing classified information. But we can confirm that Lieutenant Commander Chen's actions prevented a catastrophe that would have claimed millions of civilian lives and altered the course of American history. The President of the United States stepped forward to present the Medal of Honor posthumously, the nation's highest military decoration reserved for those who distinguished themselves through conspicuous gallantry at the risk of their lives. It was only the 3rd time in 50 years that the medal had been awarded to a woman, and the first time it had been given for actions on American soil against domestic terrorism. Sarah Chen represents the best of American military tradition, the President said, placing the medal on the casket while television cameras recorded the moment for history. Her sacrifice reminds us that freedom is preserved by individuals willing to give everything to protect others, even when those others will never know their names or understand the magnitude of their sacrifice. 6 months later, Dr. Jennifer Walsh walked through the hallways of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, checking on patients who were receiving treatment for various radiation-related injuries sustained during the tunnel operation. The cleanup effort had required hundreds of specialists, working in shifts to decontaminate the underground areas where the nuclear device had been constructed, and several team members had received significant exposure despite protective equipment. She was the daughter of Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, one of the soldiers whose death in Afghanistan had driven David Reeves to his tragic transformation from decorated engineer to domestic terrorist. Dr. Walsh had dedicated her medical career to treating radiation exposure and nuclear medicine, inspired by her mother's service and sustained by the knowledge that military sacrifice could serve positive purposes when channeled properly. "The irony isn't lost on me," she told Colonel Webb during one of his regular visits to check on the recovery teams. "My mother died in a war that drove Reeves to plan mass murder. But her death also inspired me to pursue the medical training that helped save the people who cleaned up his weapon." Webb nodded thoughtfully, understanding the complex legacy that emerged from tragic events. The official investigation had revealed the full scope of Reeves's network, leading to arrests throughout the metropolitan area and the discovery of additional weapons caches that could have been used for follow-up attacks. But it had also highlighted the psychological costs of prolonged military service and the need for better support systems for veterans struggling with combat trauma. Sarah's actions saved 8 million lives directly, Webb observed, but they also prevented a cascade of retaliatory attacks that could have claimed millions more. The psychological impact of a successful nuclear attack on the Capitol would have fundamentally changed American society. Dr. Walsh was reviewing medical files when she noticed an unusual patient record, radiation exposure case that had been classified at the highest levels of government security. The details were sparse, but the exposure levels indicated someone who had survived direct contact with an unshielded nuclear device for an extended period. "This patient should be dead," she murmured, studying the numbers that defied her understanding of radiation medicine. These exposure levels are 10 times the lethal dose, but the recovery pattern suggests not just survival, but gradual improvement. 2 years later, the Sarah Chen Center for Nuclear Security opened on the campus of Georgetown University, funded by a combination of government appropriations and private donations from families who understood that their survival had depended on one woman's courage in an underground tunnel. The center's mission was to train the next generation of nuclear security specialists, while researching improved methods for detecting and neutralizing nuclear threats. Maya Chun served on the board of directors, using her position to ensure that her sister's legacy focused on preventing future attacks rather than simply commemorating past heroism. The center's motto, engraved in bronze above the main entrance, came from Sarah's grandfather's favorite saying, "Impossible situations only stay impossible until someone figures out how to make them possible." The first class of Sarah Chun Fellows included military personnel, federal agents, and civilian scientists, all united by their commitment to preventing nuclear terrorism through a combination of technical expertise and moral courage. The curriculum included not just the technical aspects of nuclear security, but also psychological training designed to help specialists function under extreme pressure. Sarah proved that the human element is the most important factor in nuclear security, explained Dr. Michael Torres. The moment of truth arrived with startling suddenness, announced by a change in the quality of Reeves's breathing that suggested his psychological defenses had finally collapsed completely. Sarah could hear him sobbing in the darkness behind the device, his grief finally overwhelming the anger that had sustained his conviction for months of planning and preparation. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "What have I done? What was I thinking? These people, they don't deserve ... The biometric monitoring system registered his emotional breakdown as a cascade of physiological changes: elevated heart rate, irregular breathing, stress hormones flooding his bloodstream. But the sensors had been gradually recalibrated by the environmental manipulation Sarah had been implementing. Their baseline parameters shifted, just enough that the system couldn't distinguish between natural grief and artificial stimulation. Warning. Lights began flashing on the device's control panel, indicating that Reeves's vital signs were approaching the threshold values that would trigger immediate detonation. But the changes had developed gradually over the course of their conversation, appearing to be natural stress responses rather than evidence of external manipulation. Sarah watched the displays with growing hope and terror, understanding that she had successfully implemented her plan but couldn't control its final outcome. If the biometric sensors determined that Reeves was experiencing a genuine medical emergency, the device would detonate immediately. But if they interpreted his breakdown as a psychological crisis rather than a physical threat, there might be a window of opportunity to implement the next phase of her solution. "Please," Reeves called out, his voice desperate and broken. "Please help me stop this. I don't want to be responsible for ... for." The admission represented a complete psychological capitulation, the final collapse of the rationalization that had allowed him to justify mass murder as political protest. But it also created the opportunity Sarah had been maneuvering toward, a moment when Reeves's own conscience would become her greatest ally in preventing the detonation. "David," she called out, using his first name deliberately to humanize the interaction. "I can help you stop this, but I need you to walk me through the disarmament sequence. The biometric system is registering your stress responses as potential medical emergency. We have maybe minutes before it triggers automatic detonation." "I can't," Reeves sobbed, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "The system is designed to prevent unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to stop it, the fail-safes won't allow manual override once the final countdown sequence has initiated." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the full implications of his engineering paranoia. in his determination to prevent anyone else from disarming the device. Reeves had created a system that even he couldn't control once it reached certain activation thresholds. The very sophistication that made his weapon so dangerous also made it impossible to stop through conventional means. "There has to be something," she insisted, moving closer to where his voice was coming from. "Emergency protocols, master reset, codes, some kind of abort mechanism that you built in case you changed your mind." "There is one possibility," Reeves said slowly, his voice heavy with resignation. "But it requires someone to manually disconnect the fusion core while the fission trigger is still active. The radiation exposure would be lethal. Within minutes, and any mistake in the disconnection sequence would trigger immediate detonation. A suicide mission." Sarah absorbed the implications while studying the device's construction with new understanding. The fusion core was located at the center of the weapon, surrounded by the fission trigger and protected by multiple layers of shielding. Accessing it would require exposure to radiation levels that would cause rapid death from acute radiation syndrome, assuming the attempt didn't trigger the explosive components first. "Walk me through it," she said, her voice steady despite the knowledge that she was asking for instructions on how to die. "The access panel is located on the device's underside," Reeves explained, his technical training overriding his emotional breakdown as he focused on the engineering details. "You'll need to remove 12 bolts in a specific sequence to prevent triggering the anti-tamper mechanisms. Then there's a shielded compartment containing the deuterium-tritium injection system that feeds the fusion reaction." Sarah moved to examine the device's underside, her flashlight revealing the access panel Reeves had described. The bolts were arranged in a complex pattern around what appeared to be a reinforced hatch, each one marked with symbols that corresponded to the geometric patterns she had been following through the tunnel system. "The disconnection sequence is critical," Reeves continued, his voice taking on the precision of a technical manual. "You have to interrupt the tritium feed first, then the deuterium system, then manually separate the fusion core from the fission trigger. Any deviation from that sequence will cause the conventional explosives to compress the fissile material, triggering nuclear detonation even without the fusion component." The timer displays showed 1 hour and 31 minutes until primary activation. But the biometric monitoring system was registering increasingly erratic readings from Reeves's vital signs, suggesting that the fail-safe mechanism could trigger at any moment, regardless of the scheduled countdown. "David, I need you to stay calm," Sarah said, understanding that his psychological state was now directly connected to her survival and the safety of 8 million people. "The biometric sensors are reading your stress levels as potentially dangerous. Try to control your breathing and heart rate." "I can't," Reeves replied, his voice breaking again. "Every time I think about what I almost did, what I still might do, the guilt is overwhelming. 37 friends died in Afghanistan, but I was about to kill 8 million innocent people in revenge. How does that make any sense?" Sarah could hear the biometric warning systems beginning to activate, electronic tones that indicated Reeves's vital signs were approaching critical thresholds. She had successfully manipulated his psychological state to break down his justification for mass murder, but the emotional breakdown that resulted was now threatening to trigger the very catastrophe she was trying to prevent. "Focus on the technical details," she instructed, hoping that his engineering training would provide an emotional anchor. "Help me understand the disconnection sequence. What tools do I need? What are the warning signs that I'm triggering the wrong systems?" Reeves took several deep breaths, apparently trying to regain control of his physiological responses. "You'll need a torque wrench calibrated to exactly 15 foot-pounds of pressure. Too much force will activate the anti-tamper mechanisms. Too little won't properly release the locking mechanisms. The bolts have to be removed in a counterclockwise spiral pattern, starting from the center and working outward." Sarah examined the access panel more closely, noting the precision machining that characterized military-grade engineering. Each bolt was recessed into a threaded housing that would require exact alignment and pressure to avoid triggering protective systems. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any mistake would result in immediate detonation. Once you've removed the access panel, Reeves continued, you'll see two color-coded injection lines, blue for deuterium, red for tritium. There are manual shutoff valves for each system, but they're located inside the shielded compartment. The radiation exposure begins the moment you open that compartment. Sarah's training in nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare had covered radiation exposure and its effects on human physiology. Acute radiation syndrome developed in stages, beginning with nausea and fatigue within hours of exposure, and progressing to organ failure and death within days or weeks depending on the dose received. But lethal doses could cause immediate effects that would compromise her ability to complete the disarmament sequence. How much radiation are we talking about? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The fusion core generates approximately 2,000 roentgens per hour at close range. Reeves replied, his voice heavy with technical precision. Lethal dose for 50% of exposed individuals is around 400 roentgens. You'd receive a fatal dose within 12 minutes of opening the shielded compartment. 12 minutes to save 8 million lives at the cost of her own death from radiation poisoning. Sarah found herself thinking about her sister Maya and the kids, probably still at Emma's soccer game or Jake's t-ball practice, unaware that their aunt was about to sacrifice her life to ensure they would live to see another weekend. Her earpiece crackled with static. Viper 1, we're reading massive electromagnetic disturbance and what appears to be biometric warning signals from your location. What's your current status? Sarah keyed her throat mic, aware that this might be her last communication with the outside world. Command, I've established communication with the target and identified a potential disarmament procedure. The process will require manual intervention with significant personal risk, but it's the only viable option for preventing detonation. Negative, Viper 1. If the risk assessment is that severe, you need to extract immediately. We'll implement contingency evacuation procedures and accept the casualties. Accept the casualties. The clinical language couldn't disguise the reality of what Webb was suggesting: abandoning 8 million people to nuclear death, because saving them would require sacrificing one soldier. From a strategic perspective, the logic was sound. From a moral perspective, it was unacceptable. Sir, with respect, contingency evacuation isn't viable given the timeline, Sarah replied. Most of the population will still be within the blast radius when the device activates. This is the only option that prevents mass casualties. Viper 1, you are ordered to extract immediately and report to the designated rally point. That's a direct order from your commanding officer. Sarah looked at the timer displays showing 1 hour and 26 minutes until primary detonation, then at the access panel that represented her only chance to prevent the largest terrorist attack in American history. Following orders would mean condemning 8 million innocent people to death. Disobeying orders would mean sacrificing her life and military career to save people she had never met and would never know. Sir, I'm having trouble with radio reception, she lied, switching off her throat mic to cut the transmission. Going silent to complete the mission. The choice was made. Sarah Chen, Lieutenant Commander in the United States Navy, decorated veteran of 3 combat deployments, had just committed mutiny in order to attempt the disarmament of a nuclear weapon that would kill her in the process of saving 8 million civilian lives. You don't have to do this, Reeves called out, apparently having overheard her conversation with command. I could try to implement the disarmament sequence myself. It's my responsibility, my weapon, my failure. Sarah considered the offer briefly before rejecting it. Reeves's psychological state was too unstable, his biometric readings too erratic. Any attempt on his part to approach the device might trigger the fail-safe systems immediately, eliminating any chance of successful disarmament. "Your job is to keep your vital signs stable," she replied, beginning to examine the access panel more closely. "The biometric monitoring system is our biggest threat now. If your stress levels spike, this device detonates regardless of what I'm doing." She found the torque wrench among the tools scattered on the workbenches, checking its calibration against the specifications Reeves had provided. 15 foot-pounds of pressure, applied in a counterclockwise spiral pattern starting from the center bolt and working outward. The margin for error was 0. Too much force would trigger anti-tamper mechanisms. Too little wouldn't properly release the locking systems. "Sarah," Reeves said, using her first name with the familiarity of shared desperation. "Before you start, there's something you need to know about the radiation exposure. The acute effects begin almost immediately: nausea, disorientation, loss of fine motor control. You'll have maybe 10 minutes of full functionality before the radiation starts affecting your ability to work. 10 minutes to remove 12 bolts, access the shielded compartment, locate the tritium and deuterium injection lines, and manually disconnect the fusion core from the fission trigger, all while being exposed to radiation levels that would kill her within days even if she successfully prevented the detonation." Sarah's grandfather's compass seemed to burn against her chest as she positioned herself beneath the device, the small silver weight carrying with it the accumulated history of military service that had shaped her understanding of duty and sacrifice. He had carried that compass through 2 tours in Vietnam, including the siege of Khe Sanh, where Marines had held their position against overwhelming odds because the alternative was unacceptable. "The thing about impossible situations," she whispered to herself, repeating his words like a prayer, "is that they only stay impossible until someone figures out how to make them possible." She began with the center bolt, applying exactly 15 foot-pounds of pressure in a slow, counterclockwise rotation. The threads released smoothly, the precision machining allowing the bolt to turn without triggering the anti-tamper mechanisms. 1 down, 11 to go. The timer continued its inexorable countdown, 1 hour and 22 minutes until primary detonation. But time was becoming irrelevant as Sarah committed herself to a course of action that would either save 8 million lives or fail spectacularly in an attempt that would be remembered as the most heroic suicide mission in American military history. The second bolt released as smoothly as the first, followed by the third and fourth, as Sarah worked her way around the access panel in the prescribed spiral pattern. Each successful removal brought her closer to the shielded compartment, where lethal radiation waited to claim her life in exchange for the possibility of preventing mass murder. Behind her, she could hear Reeves trying to control his breathing and heart rate, understanding that his psychological state was now directly connected to her survival and the safety of everyone within 50 miles of downtown Washington. The biometric monitoring system continued its electronic surveillance, ready to trigger immediate detonation if his vital signs indicated medical emergency or external manipulation. The 8th bolt was more resistant than the others, requiring careful application of torque to avoid exceeding the pressure threshold that would activate protective systems. Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead, despite the underground chill. Her hands steady, but her heart racing with the knowledge that each bolt brought her closer to a radiation dose that would end her life regardless of whether she succeeded in preventing the nuclear detonation. "You're doing great," Reeves called out, his voice carrying the strange intimacy of shared crisis. 4 more bolts and you'll have access to the shielded compartment. Once you open that hatch, you'll have maybe 12 minutes before the radiation exposure becomes incapacitating. 12 minutes to save 8 million lives. Sarah removed the 9th bolt, then the 10th, working with the methodical precision that military training had ingrained into her muscle memory. The torque wrench felt familiar in her hands, A tool she had used hundreds of times during maintenance procedures that had never carried stakes higher than equipment failure or mission delay. The 11th bolt released with a soft click that seemed to echo through the chamber like a gunshot. Sarah paused for a moment, understanding that the next bolt was the last barrier between her and radiation exposure that would kill her within days, even if she successfully completed the disarmament sequence. Last one, she murmured to herself, positioning the torque wrench on the final bolt. 15 foot-pounds, counterclockwise, steady pressure. The bolt turned smoothly, its threads releasing the locking mechanism that had protected the shielded compartment. As it came free in her hands, Sarah heard the soft hiss of pressurized gas escaping from the sealed environment, followed by the electronic whine of radiation detection equipment, registering dangerous levels of exposure. The access hatch swung open on precision hinges, revealing the deuterium and tritium injection systems that fed nuclear fuel to the fusion reaction. Even through the shielding, Sarah could feel the heat radiating from the fusion core, a warmth that spoke to the barely contained energy that could vaporize the nation's capital if released improperly. Her radiation dosimeter began clicking with increasing frequency, marking the accumulation of exposure that would claim her life regardless of her success in preventing mass murder. But she had committed herself to this course of action, and 8 million lives depended on her ability to complete the disarmament sequence before the radiation overwhelmed her. Capacity to function. The timer displays showed 1 hour and 18 minutes until primary detonation. The biometric monitoring system registered stable readings from Reeves's vital signs. And somewhere in the clicking chaos of her radiation detector, Sarah Chen began the final phase of a mission that would either make her the greatest hero in American military history or the most spectacular failure. The radiation hit Sarah like an invisible wave of heat and nausea, her body's cellular structure beginning to break down at the molecular level as she reached into the shielded compartment. Her dosimeter was clicking so rapidly that individual counts blurred into a continuous electronic scream, measuring exposure levels that would have triggered immediate evacuation protocols in any normal situation. But this was far from normal. Sarah's hands found the blue-coated deuterium line first, following Reeves's instructions to locate the manual shutoff valve that would interrupt the nuclear fuel feed. The valve was smaller than she had expected, requiring precise finger movements that were already becoming more difficult as radiation began affecting her nervous system. "Deuterium valve first," she called out, her voice steady despite the nausea building in her stomach. Then tritium, then manual separation of the fusion core. "Quarter turn counterclockwise," Reeves replied, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored his own vital signs to prevent triggering the biometric failsafes. "Too far and you'll rupture the containment system." Sarah's hands were beginning to shake as the radiation exposure affected her fine motor control, but years of weapons training had taught her to function despite physical stress. She gripped the valve carefully, applying gentle pressure. The valve turned smoothly, and she felt the pressure change as deuterium flow ceased. The tritium valve was more delicate, requiring even finer control as her vision began to blur. She took a deep breath, focusing all her concentration on the Faiwa. Precise movements. The valve resisted, then suddenly gave way with a soft click. "Both fuel systems offline," she reported, her voice beginning to slur. "What's next?" "4 clamps securing the fusion core," Reeves explained urgently. "They have to be released simultaneously, or asymmetric pressure will cause detonation." Sarah studied the coupling system. 4 massive clamps around a cylindrical chamber. She pulled her tactical belt free, positioning it across all 4 release levers to create multiple pressure points. It was crude, improvised, desperate. "This either works or we find out what nuclear explosion looks like from ground zero," she muttered. Her strength was fading rapidly as radiation poisoning reached critical levels. Vision blurring, hands shaking, she had one chance. Sarah threw her weight against the belt, applying simultaneous pressure to all 4 releases. The mechanisms triggered within milliseconds of each other. The fusion core separated from the fission. Trigger with a mechanical click that seemed impossibly small for such a significant moment. The electromagnetic pulse that followed was massive but brief, disabling electronics throughout the metropolitan area, but leaving the nuclear components inert and harmless. Sarah collapsed beside the disarmed device, her body finally succumbing to radiation exposure that had claimed her life even as she saved 8 million others. Her last conscious thought was of her grandfather's compass, still warm against her chest, a reminder that impossible situations only stayed impossible until someone figured out how to make them possible. The timer displays went dark. The mechanical ticking stopped, and in the silence that followed, 8 million people continued their weekend routines, unaware that they owed their lives to a woman who had proven that courage could overcome any engineering challenge when human lives hung in the balance. 3 days later, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The funeral drew thousands, families with children, elderly couples, young professionals, all representatives of the 8 million lives preserved through her ultimate sacrifice. The official citation read simply, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty." But those who knew the full story understood that Sarah Chen had accomplished something far greater. She had proven that one person's courage could change the world, even at the cost of everything. What an incredible story of sacrifice and heroism. Stories like Sarah's take tremendous time and effort to research and craft. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories of courage and sacrifice.